that we are now going live on YouTube. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kristen Don Hefner and I am the Measure 110 Engagement Manager with the Oregon Health Authority, and I will be assisting with facilitating today's meeting. The Oversight and Accountability Council welcomes and encourages community input. Members of the public are invited to submit public comments or get on our interested parties email list by emailing oha.measure110@dhsoha.state.or.us. That email address and more information about the council can be found on the Measure 110 OAC website. I will now turn it over to Carly to take attendance.
Okay. Amy?
I'm here.
You still here? Blue?
Here.
Carlos is gone. Caroline is gone. Dharma, are you still here?
Yep, here.
Perfect. Henry? Are you still here, Henry?
It's usually the
here.
Got it. Melinda? Oh, I skipped some names. Sorry. Hubert?
I'm here.
Jackie Mercer? Are you
Here.
here? Oh. Keisha?
Here.
Leticia?
Here.
Melinda?
Here.
Morgan?
Here.
Nicole?
I'm here.
Onisha? Onisha, are you still here? We'll come back to her. Melinda. Oh no, sorry. Sabrina.
Here.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm here.
Zeb, are you still here?
Yes, I'm here.
And Tori.
I'm also here.
And Steve.
Yep. Hello, everybody.
Hi. Okay, and we have 16 voting members.
Great, thanks. Over to you, Blue.
Thank you.
Hey,
All right,
Blue,
so-
I'm so sorry,
Yeah.
but the captioner just messaged me and said that her computer froze. So if we want captioning to go on, we might need to wait just a second. I'm really sorry to cut you off, but I know that that's important to you.
Yeah, captions help me as well. So I guess we can try to pause real quick and see if we can get that fixed.
She's good. She's good now. Sorry, I think I got a delayed message, but she's good. You're good to go. Sorry about that.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so in today's public meeting, we are going to have Kristen talk about renovating leased property through Measure 110, and we will have a vote on that as well. And then there will be some updates from OHA and the tri-chairs. And if there's time, I think we had some questions in executive session that were more appropriate for a public meeting. So we put those on pause. If we don't have time, we can add those to the next agenda. And I just want to apologize in advance for my voice. I'm doing my best. I'm glad it's not fully gone. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kristen.
Thanks, Blue. I'll take over talking for a while so you can rest. And Carly, can you pull up the slides, please? Thank you. So today we want to talk to all of you about the current grant requirements for securing property and an issue we have run into with a few grantees and those requirements. So the grant agreements currently impose the following obligation on all grantees, and that's when the OAC funds in the amount of $10,000 and above. Property is to be used for purchase or renovation of real property. The grantee shall contact the social determinants of health team of OHA and follow procedures as prescribed by that unit. And the required procedure based on your vote on June 1st, 2022, is to require that the state and your interest is secured in the property by a trust deed or another instrument for a 20-year term. And that's really to ensure that the dollars that are invested in these properties continue to be used for the intended purpose for that 20-year term. Next slide. Do you want me to share them, Carly? They went away.
We also do have that Onisha is here in the chat just in case that didn't get noted.
Thanks, Blue. Oh, it's okay. It's okay, Carly. I can read your lips. You're on mute, but I have the slide, so I don't mind going ahead and sharing my screen if that's helpful.
Sorry, it quit, and when it changed, I had to close it and I'm reopening it. So just give me just 1 second.
No worries. I have it pulled up, so I do not mind
Okay.
sharing.
Oh, it's right there. Okay.
Yep. It's all good. So the grant recipients must execute what we call a declaration of restrictive covenants with the Oregon Health Authority on behalf of the council. This declaration imposes a use restriction on the property for 20 years, and that declaration must be signed by the recipient or the property owner, and it's recorded with the county property purchase, and the restrictions follow the property around. So even if the owner were to change hands, the property still has to be used for its intended purpose, whether it's housing or a commercial space or whatever the grantee was approved to do with that space. And importantly, the grant doesn't need to be repaid if the recipient meets the use restriction for the 20 years. So the declaration of restrictive covenants tool for securing real property improvements on leased property does not work well for the Measure 110 grants because the declarations cannot be recorded on property without the consent of the landowner. And a few of the Measure 110 grant agreements are for property improvements with leasees and with not the landowner. So a grantee wants to renovate, say, the waiting room of a building that they lease, not that they own. And so we can't record a trust deed on that property to secure that space for its intended use because we don't have consent of the landowner. There are fewer than 10 of these grants with funding for improvements to leased property. And the grant amounts are for $300,000 or less for these lease circumstances. So really affects a very small number of folks and a small amount of funding. So we do want to acknowledge that we want to continue to secure our interest in this investment in this space. So our proposed solution for these few individuals is to not require a declaration of restricted covenants for current recipients previously approved to use grant funds for improving leased property if that investment is under $300,000. And instead to amend the grant agreements to require that the current grant recipients previously approved to use the funding for improving leased properties have to use that property to provide the services for SUD clients for a specific term of years between 1 and 5 years, based on the assessment of the value of the investment, and to require that the grantee repay the grant pro rata for any property improvement costs if the property is not used for that term or if the lease is broken by the grant recipient as required for the full use term. So if a grantee wanted to renovate their waiting space for a leased property, they did that. They only leased it for 3 years instead of 5 years. They would have to pay back the grant kind of proportional for those 2 years that they weren't able to use that space. So this is a proposed motion to authorize OHA to amend grant agreements that currently provide funding for the improvement of leased property to require the grantees to make a dedicated use of the improvements for intended purposes for a minimum of 1 year and a maximum of 5 years if the grant funding is equal to or less than $300,000. We wouldn't require a declaration of restricted covenant in that case. And the grant amendments must require grant recipients who do not comply with the full dedicated use term to repay grant funds dispersed for real property improvements in an amount proportionate to the percentage of the dedicated use period not fulfilled by the recipient. So I know that was a lot in a short amount of time, but I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes, Keisha.
So I'm just wondering if the landowner has to approve renovations, wouldn't that still be in effect regardless of the time frame if the landlord doesn't approve renovations for a property that's leased? Like, how would that work?
Well, if the landlord didn't approve the renovations to be done, then I think the grantee would have to come back to us and with a different plan for what to do with that money. This is only in the event that the landlord approves the renovation and they can move forward with that space.
So they would have to provide some documentation that the landlord approved the renovations.
Yeah,
Okay.
and that's kind of implied if they're providing, you know, receipts of construction and that kind of thing. I'm not sure who is next, Blue or Sabrina. I think Blue and then Sabrina.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to get a little bit of clarity and make sure that I'm understanding this correctly, that this is essentially closing up a loophole in what we had initially sort of voted on because there were people who were leasing and not purchasing property. And we just want to make sure that they're not using Measure 110 money to improve property and then turn around and stop providing services and essentially take advantage of having those renovations paid for. Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. Then you go ahead, Sabrina.
So I have 3 questions, Kristen. I'll start with the one that I've been asking you that I think you might be prepared for. It's what if they go through with the renovations and then the lease is broken by the actual owner of the person leasing the property earlier? What would happen in that situation? And hopefully I explained that correctly.
Yep, you did. So in that event, the grantee would have to repay the cost of the construction based on how long they were able to use the property for.
Okay, my second question is, I'm interested in seeing a list of the organizations. I don't know if that's realistic or not, or if you can point me in the right direction. I'm just kind of interested in knowing, is that feasible or is that realistic for me to look at that information?
I can follow up after this meeting with that information.
Okay, awesome. And that's all. Thank you, Kristen.
Welcome. Dharma put a question in the chat that I might have to ask DOJ to answer if we can build in exceptions or relief for folks who do have to break their lease or whose landlords might terminate their lease.
I just wonder, like, if we would put undue stress on like a newer organization that was providing services, especially in rural areas where they might not have another option. I'm just trying to, make sure that we're watching out for the service providers as well. In the case that like something that's extraneous, right? Like their landlord breaking their lease or selling the property out from underneath them, they're going to have to pay all those funds back. Or I know it's proportional to the time that they use the space, but I guess I'm just wondering if we can build in some kind of protection for the providers.
Kristen, do you want me to jump in? This is Ben.
Yes, please.
This is Ben Eckstein, he, him, his, DOJ. So I think if I'm understanding the hypothetical, if a landlord, so I mean, to be clear, right, like OAC and OHA, we are not part of that landlord-tenant relationship. But in general, in that kind of a hypothetical, I think the tenant would have potentially remedies to go against the landlord for violating the lease. So, we don't represent the tenants, obviously, and they might need to have their own counsel that would help them with that. But, we're definitely not saying that it's okay for a landlord to break the lease. So if something did happen like that kind of a scenario, generally, I would think that the tenant might have some remedies against the landlord and potentially be able to recover some of those funds because the landlord broke the lease and caused damages. That would probably be where they would look.
So even in the case, though, of like a legal breakage of the lease, though, we could still have burn providers be liable to pay us back funds if the building was sold, for instance, right?
If like in the example, like let's say that they were committed, they agreed to a dedicated use period of 5 years. And let's assume before they do that, they make sure that they have protection under their lease and that their lease term covers that. If the landlord did something that violated the lease, so you kind of have two things happening in parallel. On the one hand, we don't get, we being the state and OAC, don't get that 5 years of use. So there would be an obligation to pay back whatever the proportional amount is that wasn't used. But again, on the flip side, if the landlord breaks the lease, that might be damages that the tenant has against the landlord. So, I mean, it's not okay for the landlord to come in and break the lease. And if they do that, there might be remedies that the tenant has to go after the landlord to recover some of those funds. But those are kind of two separate issues, because one is the OAC relationship with the service provider, and the other is the service provider relationship with their landlord, which we're not part of.
I had a question, but if you wanted to jump in, John, I can go after you.
Oh, thanks. Just a quick clarification for Ben as he's explaining this stuff to y'all. Hey, Ben, in that situation we were just talking about, would it also be possible if it created undue stress on the grantee for them to maybe bring information back to the council and have them make a decision as to whether or not they truly owed the rest of the money?
Yeah, thanks for that reminder as well. So in the event that there is a situation like that, it's also totally possible and likely that OAC could get legal advice in terms of what its options are. And one of those options might be to waive those damages, or, right? I mean, OAC ultimately would have to make the decision to go and recover those funds. And depending on the situation, OAC may decide that it is not, a sensible course of action to go after that grantee and recover the funds. So, yeah, that would be something on a case-by-case basis that would still be an option for the council to consider.
I had a couple of questions, Dharma, but was your next question going to be pertaining to this?
It was. I was just worried about like providers who might be popping up, especially like harm reduction services, where they might be like run into like a conservative property owner who maybe doesn't want them to do a needle exchange on their property, and just thinking about how that rollout might affect them. So I think that's the backup. I just wanted to point to why it might be an issue. But thank you. Go ahead, Sabrina.
Okay, I had a couple of questions. It's all actually one question, but 3 points I was going to ask somebody. So because of the amount that these organizations might be asking to lease, they're going to have to provide documentation with an agreement from their landlord saying that the repairs, whatever pertaining to the lease, I should just say that I'm not very familiar with the property. I apologize. So they'll provide documentation saying, yes, we're in agreement for the lease, blah, blah, blah. And then will you guys bring that information back to us as the council before you guys proceed, or will that just be happening behind closed doors? And will we know after those are met, or will just continue business as normal?
Well, similar to how the declarations of restricted use kind of happen throughout the course of, as part of our grant administration efforts, this would also happen. So we would verify that, the grantee was approved to make, $100,000 worth of repairs for a harm reduction center. I'm making this up, by the OAC, and that it falls kind of in line with what was approved and what was agreed upon.
Thank you.
Dharma, did you have another question?
No, sorry.
Okay. So I guess my question is about the issue that Dharma did bring up. Is that something that we should also try to work into a separate motion, or maybe the same motion, or just making sure that we have that that balance of being able to protect some of these providers that might be leasing?
I'm not sure if a separate motion would be necessary, but I think I would defer to Ben on that, or if what we have is sufficient. And if any, there's nothing that would preclude a grantee from coming back to you all.
Yeah, I guess my general inclination would be that I don't think you would need a motion or a different motion at this point, because in practice, what would happen if a situation like that arose would be that it would go to the council, you would consider what your options are and whether you want to pursue remedies under the grant, and then make that decision. So just because the council could exercise a remedy like recovering funds doesn't mean necessarily that the council has to do that or will decide to do that. So I think that would be something that you'd address down the line if, and hopefully that situation wouldn't happen, but if a situation like that did arise, it would be for the council to address it at that time.
Sabrina?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure. And in that instance, then there would be need to be documentation of how it was undue stress and kind of not on the awardee's part, but on the landlord's. Would that be provided, or would that need to be needed?
I would think that would be right. Yes, I mean, if I were a grantee and I were in that situation, I would think that it would be in my interest to provide that and to show. Because, if I agreed to a 5-year commitment and something happened that prevented me as the grantee from meeting that commitment, it would be in my interest to make that clear to the council that these are the circumstances that happened. We didn't foresee it. There was a violation of the lease. Here's the action we took to prevent that violation from happening, those kinds of details.
Perfect. Thank you.
I want to see if it'd be okay if we put the proposed motion language back up.
Yeah, I have it ready. 1 second.
So I am concerned about the language in that number 2, that it doesn't say, it just says they will have to repay, but it doesn't say, I guess, it says they must require grant recipients to repay the funds, but it sounded like we had talked about a couple of exceptions, so I don't know if.
Yeah, just to clarify that, Blue, that's a good point. I think the key there is that it just says that the grant amendments require that. So the language in the grant would say that they have to, would say they have to comply with the dedicated use period. And if they don't, that, they would repay the funds. Excuse me. But again, at that point in time, OAC might decide to waive that if a situation came up where it was justified. So just because the grant agreement gives that right to the council doesn't mean that the council necessarily will enforce it when the time comes.
I guess my concern might be that it might send the signal to folks that they would not want to do kinds of important renovations if that's written in there without a caveat that indicates to them that we will like have their best interest in mind if it comes to that. I guess I'd be most comfortable with an amendment to that just points to that the council has authority over that determination. Just so that we can encourage folks to make needed renovations or to pursue these things if it's the best thing for their clients, but also know that they'll have protection if needed.
I think that if the council went that direction, I think that what DOJ would need would be some clear guidance on how you actually want those sideboards built into the contract, which could be a little difficult to do. So just as an example, there are already a lot of provisions in the contract that provide remedies to the council. Like there's Section 5 of Exhibit B that has recovery of funds that says if there are funds that are expended for the wrong purposes or funds that are not expended, that the grantee has to pay those back. But that situation has not come up to my knowledge, but it would be the same thing. So there are a lot of provisions in the grant that already give rights to the council. And that doesn't mean that the council necessarily exercises all of those remedies. That's a decision that the council makes if a violation happens. So this would be similar language to that existing language. And same thing for the folks who are using their funds and doing the declaration. But this is just really provides some relief to those folks that can't do the declaration currently because they have leases.
Hey, this is Amy Madrigal. I have to sign off for a second because I have a client. So I'm going to have to sign off and sign back on in order to, if we're going to vote.
Okay, thank you.
Something that we could do, this might address that point, and just in terms of making it clear up front, we could add language to the effect of unless otherwise authorized by the OAC. To be clear, that's always kind of the case. That's implied generally, so it doesn't really change in substance. But if you just want to make sure that it's in there so that a grantee reading it can see that, that would be a simple way of signaling that without having to get too into the weeds or too complicated about how we phrase that.
Jack, yeah, you've had your hand up. Go ahead. I know we're just about at time, but go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Just
No,
a
you're
couple
good.
quick questions. Thank you. One is that I was wondering if these funds have already been given to places that may have already made arrangements, and will it impact anybody who's currently leasing that may not have known it was a 5-year commitment, or is there any implications like that?
I think for those folks, it would actually be giving them some relief, because right now it's a 20-year commitment. And the problem for the people that have those leases right now is that they would have to go to their landlords and basically get consent for a 20-year declaration, which their landlords may not give. So this is a way around that for them. So it's actually, it's giving them a kind of flexibility in the situation that they otherwise wouldn't have.
I see. So it's down to 5 years from 20.
Correct. Yeah, it would be a maximum of 5 years, depending on the amount of the repairs. I think it could be. So it would be 1 to 5 year commitment. But yes, as opposed to 20 years, which is what the other grantees that actually own the property are doing 20-year commitments.
Okay, I get it. Thank you. There was one other question I put in the chat a little earlier. There were some questions that folks asked that they were told they would get answers to them later. Would any of those need to be answered before this group could vote?
I think those were sort of separate questions, not directly related to this particular motion, but maybe Kristen could also just verify that. I believe they were just separate issue questions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, so I know we're at time, but there is a suggestion from Shannon in the chat about a way to sort of amend the last part of number 2. But I know it'll take us probably at least 10 minutes to go through a vote. So I just want to know if we've got enough people that can even stay.
I think we lost a few people, but Dharma did suggest that we just table the vote
Yeah.
till
right.
next week, and we can make this change and kind of put it back up on the screen. So everyone has a chance to look at it. And again, I'm sorry for the timing on this meeting. I really wasn't sure how long it was going to take in executive session.
No worries. Sabrina, did you have something real quick?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if we have a running log of the concerns or questions or discussions that we were going to address at a later time. That way we can talk about it in the tri-chair meeting tomorrow. Thank you very much, Kristen. And that's all I had.
Perfect. And that was the questions from the executive session that we couldn't. Perfect. All right. Thank you, everybody, for staying a couple minutes late.
So we'll be able to talk about those policy proposals next agenda.
We can add it to next agenda.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
We're going to talk about it tomorrow at the tri-chair meeting, Morgan.
Okay, cool.
All right, thank you all.